Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Thank you very much, Leigh.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, this has been a debate in two parts. First of all, we have heard some very moving testimony from honourable members on both sides of the House about the evils of anti-Semitism and some personal experiences, particularly from the honourable gentleman for Hemsworth. And everybody in this House agrees wholeheartedly with those moving testimonies, and everybody in the House accepts that we should have an appropriate memorial to the Holocaust. So that's been one part of the debate, and then we've had two very well researched, very well thought out speeches from my honourable friend for Westminster, the local Member of Parliament, and from my honourable friend for Worthing, which have not denied the need for a memorial, but in great detail have explained why this sort of memorial and the way it is constructed is not appropriate for this site at this time. This is such an important issue, and we are all united in wanting to do it well, that we should ensure that this memorial is done well. Now, I've been to the Holocaust museums in Berlin and in Washington. They are the most comprehensive, moving, enormous edifices. And you are taking through a whole series of rooms explaining to you exactly how anti-Semitism originated and the final result of the Holocaust, and that is the sort of Holocaust museum that we should have in London. The problem with this site, it is so constrained that frankly it doesn't do justice to this cause and this issue. You are having to dig down into a park, 2 stories, but you're only going to have a couple of rooms. You won't be able to develop the whole narrative. And that is why the Imperial War Museum quite rightly offered, it already has a good Holocaust gallery. There is a lot of space next to the Imperial War Museum. They were very prepared, are very prepared, I'm sure, to develop a world-class Holocaust museum. So the problem, and this is why I want to join my honourable friend for Worthing in suggesting a compromise, and I have put this, I think I've asked a series of questions about this. I declare an interest. I live, as many members of Parliament, I suppose I live half a mile away or maybe a mile away, and of course I work in this building. I'm very conscious that this, as my honourable friend for Westminster said, is one of the most overcrowded parts of the United Kingdom. There are literally thousands of people who live and work extremely close to this very small park. And if you go there on a summer's afternoon, as we've had in recent days, you will see it absolutely packed, every inch packed with people who work and live in Westminster, who are trying to get a bit of sun and air and green. Now, my compromise, which I've suggested to the Secretary of State and to many others, is that I'm perfectly happy with the concept, and many others, I think, would have been perfectly happy with the concept of having a memorial to the Holocaust in the park. A memorial which could be aesthetically pleasing, could be dynamic, could express the whole issue in very powerful terms. I'm very conscious of the superb monuments we already have in the park, which detail, for instance, anti-slavery. I mean, this country led the world campaign against the slave trade, and the Buxton Memorial explains that whole campaign very powerfully in a very aesthetically and beautiful way. You've got this superb Rodin monument, the Burghers of Calais, which explains the story in a very powerful way, and you've got the superb Pankhurst monument, which also powerfully proclaims the fight for votes for women. And I've always argued that it would be perfectly possible at the fairly close to the playground to have a monument which would not, as my honourable friend for Westminster said, overpower the park, but would tell the story. Now, the trouble with the Ottawa monument, which we are importing, is it is simply huge. It is a vast mound. It is frankly hideous. It's a mound with great sort of metal spikes sitting out of it. It would completely or not or partially block the iconic view of the Palace of Westminster from the end of the park, which is the subject of thousands of photographs and pictures. And as my honourable friend for Worthing said, that if we had started this whole process without proposing a totally inadequate underground learning centre and just satisfied ourselves with a monument, this could already have been built. And the powerful message that people say that we should, get on with this, well, let's get on with this. Let's build a monument, whether we build it in the Victoria Tower Gardens or whether we build it in College Green, as my honourable friend says, let's get on with it. You don't need to start building this underground learning centre. So I think that the letter to the Times, the 2nd of October, signed by 8 Jewish peers, is worth highlighting. They express their concerns and reservations regarding the project as proposed for Victoria Tower Gardens. This is a Grade 2 listed park, and part of it is included in a UNESCO World Heritage Site that we are treaty bound to respect. The gardens are under the purview of the Royal Parks, who have never supported siting such a prominent and large memorial here. Their chairman, Lord Grossman, wrote to me specifically clarifying this. He said that the Royal Parks, and I quote, has concerns about the potential risk of such a building on the intrinsic qualities of a well-used public park in an area of the city with a limited number of open spaces. There are concerns that if this beautiful space is going to be sacrificed, it would create a precedent that could be repeated for other green spaces under the management of the Royal Parks. The park is frequently used on a daily basis by visitors to the city, by those who work nearby and by local residents, and everybody knows that. So I believe that it would simply be impossible for Victoria Tower Gardens to continue in its current useful way if this plan goes ahead. Now, the London County Council Improvements Act 1900 introduced statutory protections for Victoria Tower Gardens, which are now being decisively undermined. This was a specific Act of Parliament solemnly created to provide a green space for working class people in the middle of Westminster. Now, the purpose of this memorial will be to commemorate those who were victims of this great crime, as well as to teach current and future generations. So that means we want as many people to go there. We hope it'll be well used. And I'm sorry, these are practical points, but existing pressures on Millbank will only be compounded by traffic related to accessing the memorial. We have not been informed of any plans to deal with coach traffic, halting which puts the memorial here. Putting the memorial here will be bound to generate. No parking spaces or dropping off zones for coaches are included. The local Thorney Island Society has stated it is obviously very concerned at the loss of this small valuable park, because it is difficult to imagine that a project of this size and importance would not dominate the space and transform it from a tranquil local park to a busy civic space. The subterranean nature of the plans for the Holocaust Memorial add a further layer of complication to using Victoria Tower Gardens. This is a riparian location, right on the banks of the River Thames. As recently as June 2016, 50 local properties were flooded from underneath following heavy downpours. In ancient marshland like this, it's all too easy for the water table to rise alarmingly when there's a period of sudden and heavy rainfall. Further objections can be raised when we consider that Victoria Tower Gardens is already home to existing memorials of a smaller but appropriate scale, and I mentioned them already. So I believe that these incredibly important memorials to the slave trade, to votes for women, will be overshadowed. The design remit sent out to architecture firms competing to design the memorial included the criteria that the monument, and I quote, must enhance Victoria Tower Gardens, improving the visual and sensory experience of this green space. And this plan simply does not meet that criteria. Instead, we will have an 80-metre ramp, creating a wide moat splitting the park, with paving areas replacing swathes of grass. Since it was created, Victoria Tower Gardens has been associated with an uninterrupted sweep of grass between the magnificent rows of trees, superbly framing the Palace of Westminster and Victoria Tower. If this plan goes ahead, that splendid view will be lost forever. Now, another point is I sit on the programme board for the restoration and renewal of the Palace of Westminster, and the Holocaust Memorial Project has a direct impact on this huge undertaking. Mr. Deputy Speaker, you're also on this board, so you know these problems very well. Renovating the palace will take many years, almost certainly over a decade. To do this job well, effectively, and with good value for money, we will need as much flexibility as possible. Now, some part of Victoria Tower Gardens will be useful as a staging ground for the works that will be undertaken for the palace. We need as much wriggle room as possible, and the Holocaust Memorial would make working on the palace more constrictive and possibly more costly in both time and money. Now, there are suitable alternative locations. As I have said, and I want to stress this point, instead of building an entirely new Holocaust Learning Centre, why not take advantage of the Imperial War Museum, where there is plenty of room? This site at the Imperial War Museum would be less than half a mile from the current proposal, so it would still be an accessible, prominent, central London location. And I repeat that there is no objection from virtually everybody to having a memorial in the park, just not having the underground learning centre. So I believe that for all these reasons, and I particularly support the brilliant speech by my honourable friend for Westminster, this is simply a design which is the wrong design. It is undermining in its complexity, its controversy of what we are trying to achieve. And I do appeal to the Secretary of State, who has now rejoined our debate, to try and achieve some compromise. This whole controversy, this whole delay is doing no good to this cause. If he can just work with the father of the house, with Westminster City Council, I am sure that in a matter of months they could come to an agreement to build a worthy memorial. And in time, we can also work with all interested parties to create a fantastic, world-class Holocaust museum, which would explain the whole story properly. I'm simply suggesting a compromise and a way forward, and I hope the Secretary of State will consider that that compromise is worth thinking about.